Term Point Solutions implements Microsoft Dynamics Business Central. More importantly, we really focus on the process design.
Various products and solutions that are built entirely in the cloud platform of Business Central, and this allows customers to upgrade to new versions of Business Central very easily.
Well, it's easy to take your existing processes that are built on your current ERP solution, whether that's QuickBooks or an older version of Nav, and re-implement those processes into the new system. That is giving up a great opportunity to make changes to your processes and how you approach your day-to-day work. Exactly. We help our clients analyze what the business needs are and then design new processes to fit well within the application so that they can easily upgrade that system from years to come.
Please welcome our next speaker, Maher Malki, a project manager. Today, he will be presenting lessons learned from a 19-day BC cloud implementation. Please stick around after Maher's session for a live Q&A.
Welcome to DynamicsCon. Today we're going to cover lessons learned in a 19-day Business Central cloud implementation. Stories from a very rapid cloud implementation. Today I'm joined with Greg Williams, my co-host, who's a Dynamics practice manager at Western Computer based out of Michigan. My name is Maher Malki. I am project manager at Western Computer based out of New Jersey.
Hi, everyone. This is Greg. Happy to be with all of you today. And please keep in mind that throughout the presentation, you can enter the questions live and we'll be responding to them.
Thank you, Greg. In starting an implementation with such rapid timelines, we had to establish rules of engagement going into the project. One of the most important things is everyone is on deck and ready to go part of the project, meaning the executive management team was a big part of the project. The department leaders or department heads were also a big part of the project. And then, of course, the end users. In this implementation, we measured all deadlines in hours, not days or weeks, as we do in a typical implementation. So everybody's tasks were given a number of hours to be completed rather than days or weeks throughout the entire project. We did have parallel work streams that ran simultaneously throughout the entire project. Things like data migration, which we'll talk about in great detail later, ran parallel to everything. Training and e-learning from day one to beyond go live continued rolling over and over again. And of course, have to mention the level of effort that it took, which included long hours and working on the weekends.
So Maher, when you talk about everyone on deck, what did that mean in terms of time commitment from the different groups of users on this slide?
Great question, Greg. It meant 100% time commitment from everybody involved. The only way we could be successful is to have the various layers of management on the calls engaged, as well as garnering their buy-ins. One of the most important parts of an implementation is quick decision making. And we didn't have the luxury of days or weeks for people to go back and talk to their department managers or executives about decisions that needed to be made. Decisions had to be made on the fly, on the spot, as quickly as possible.
So when you talk about deadlines measured in terms of hours, not days or weeks, does that mean, for example, that if you asked IT for an export of the customer master file from the legacy system, that you asked for it by 10 a.m. tomorrow, not sometime tomorrow?
That's absolutely right. It was a drop what you're doing and get us this data by this time. And that time is usually, depending on the level of effort for the task, was either 2 hours, 4 hours, or 6 hours. In the example that you brought to the table here is a typical 4 to 6 hour request. IT team or the data team, we need this data, albeit customer or item data, by 6 p.m. or 8 a.m. tomorrow morning. And sure enough, they delivered.
So I think I understand parallel work streams. When we get into the effort that was put forth, can you define a little bit more on what long hours and weekends actually meant? Because I think some of us have different ideas of what that entails.
Absolutely, absolutely. So late nights, right? We were working around the clock. Our typical day started at 7 a.m. and we didn't wrap up until 9 p.m. That was our typical day, and driving this home. There was a little bit of project fatigue in there, but we found ways to kind of loosen that up. Weekends on the table. So these hours that I described earlier were also during the weekends. We were together Saturday mornings at 7 o'clock and rolling through until the wee hours of the morning. Of course, we had to take little bio breaks and lunch and dinner breaks in between. But long hours, there's no way around it. They were there.
Great. I think that really helps to understand what you're up against right from the beginning here. And it sounds like you were really able to set the tone for the project.
We tried. I think we had a big success factor was that we had one of the executives on their side were really trying to drive this home in that time. They cleared the path for us. That's why it was so important to have the executive management team. They were with us lockstep every single hour that we were on the wire together with the project team. So that was very important to be able to garner that buy-in as well.
Yeah, that's amazing.
All right, so trying to take on such a huge task in a short amount of time like this, or any project for that matter, scope is very important. And one of the rules of engagement was we had to define a scope, lock it down, and keep that scope throughout the entire life cycle of the project. So here what we did was we defined what was in scope. And what we did was we ran with financials. Of course, we had to do the general ledger, accounts payable and receivables, and then your basic bank. We also did sales order processing and purchase order processing. And then, of course, we had to roll in inventory as well. What was out of scope, however, was some of the advanced financial modules like fixed assets, cash flow, budgets, and of course, automatic bank rec. Those can all come later. Warehouse management, okay, so that we knew was important to them, and we knew was on the docket for a later phase. Third-party interfaces, EDI, Power BI, and of course, custom extensions, all of which we knew we had to do at later or subsequent phases. But for that initial phase, to get them up and running, all of this had to be put out of scope and set aside for the time being.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because a lot of times as projects people, we get hung up on defining what's in scope, but we don't think to clearly define up front what's out of scope. Because it's in this scenario, this is out of scope. Don't even ask about it, and we're going to tell you up front. So I think that was a great way to just get ahead of any type of scope creep right from the start.
That's exactly right.
Were there any times when you had to think about these future scope items, though, while you were doing this, first initial 2 to 3 week project?
Absolutely. So every decision point that was made throughout the 19 days of implementing this project was with the forethought of we have some downstream things that we want to do, albeit warehouse management, EDI, Power BI. So when the decisions were being made, we were trying to guide the client to make the right decisions for when we roll these other modules in. So that becomes important so that we're not reworking the system, not redoing setups. We wanted to make sure that the decisions that they were making upfront were going to be helpful throughout not only the life cycle of that 19-day project, but for all the future project scopes that we were going to do for that.
Were there any of these items that you did actually get started on while you were in the project?
Absolutely. So when you think about how we structured the data and how we did some of the setups, we had to make sure that the setups that were being put in place at the time were going to give us the end result of what they were looking for. For example, when they were running some Power BI reports, right? So the setups were done in a meaningful fashion for reporting. The setups were done in a meaningful fashion for EDI, so that we knew that when they were going to roll in these other modules, we already have the lion's share of the base setup already well thought out for those ancillary modules.
That's great. So now that we've discussed the scope, well, why don't we take a look at the timeline and plan together?
Excellent, excellent. So here you'll find the timeline that we put in place, and we're going to break this down into greater detail. One of the things that I want to certainly point out is right in the beginnings, in the initiation phase, what we did was we had a project kickoff, and we're going to talk all about that and what we agreed on, but then we quickly created a project plan and was able to get buy-in on that project plan almost immediately. Provisioning that environment is super important. And then you'll see it's broken down into three main sections: the requirements, the data migration, and the training. Most important thing that I want to bring your eyes to is that e-learning row under training, that first row. That first e-learning row ran the entire life of the project, and really, quite frankly, beyond. They kept using some of the e-learning tools provided by Microsoft. And to me, I believe that was one of the key factors of success here.
Great. So why don't we get into a little more of the details of what we went through on each day?
You got it. So day one, we had some very clear defined deliverables for the first day. Project planning, right? We had to lock up calendars for all project resources, executives, managers, power users, end users, even our resources, all resources across the board. We made sure we locked up calendars as step one across the board. We had to set some deadlines for things to access the source data. So we needed that source data by certain timeframes. So immediately on day one, the data team knew what they were up against, when we needed certain sections of the data pulled from the legacy system, when it needed to be scrubbed, and when it was going to be imported into Business Central. Learning plans goes back to one of the most important points I talked about with that timeline. Learning plans were developed for every individual within the organization based on their department. The learning plans were a combination of some e-learning, some train the trainer, and then some end user training as well. Again, one of the keys to success there. And then finally, we developed a project plan with absolute deadlines, and meeting those deadlines were very critical to the overall project. Infrastructure. On day one, we were able to provision Business Central immediately. We ensured that all users had access to the MS Learning platform and have Business Central cloud environment provisioned and all users added. So by the end of our first day, what you'll see here is we locked up all the resources, we got their calendars, we developed their learning plans, we developed the timeline, had an entire environment provisioned, and got everybody on board with some e-learning.
Yeah, I think that's amazing, and it really shows the power of the cloud. On a traditional on-premise or hosted project, at 19 days, you'd still be ordering hardware and installing it.
That's absolutely correct.
Wouldn't even have an environment yet. So having an environment from Microsoft in a few hours is amazing. The other thing is, I'm glad that you really closed the loop on users having access to MS Learn, because just getting through some of those username and password authentication issues can create, gaps or because users are always like, oh, I didn't get a chance to get in yet. I don't have my login. Where's my login? So you really have to get ahead of that right away, and I'm glad you did.
Moving on to day two, accounting and company setup. At this point, we had an environment provisioned, everybody has access, and everybody's in the system. We wake up on day two, and in the morning, we begin with a solution overview training with some key concepts. Key concepts like dimensions, posting groups, things that are really specific and unique to Business Central. So we got them to understand what they are, why they're there, and of course, when we're making those decisions on what they should look like, we had the future in mind. Power BI, reporting, EDI in mind when making some of these decisions. Export of the chart of accounts from the legacy system. This is a great example of us letting the data team know that we needed that export of the chart of accounts literally the day before. And they had to provide it to us the next morning. Again, measured in hours, not in days. And then we began to do the company setup in Business Central. In the afternoon, now that we had that data, we cleaned it up a little bit in terms of the chart of accounts. We imported the GL straight in. With the GL imported in, we're able to configure things like the posting groups and dimensions. Remember, we just train them on this in the morning, so they know or have a taste of the power of the dimensions and some of the posting groups. And we brought in the chart of accounts. Now we're configuring it in real time. So that was day two, pardon me. That was day two in terms of getting that initial company set up and getting accounting stood up on its own 2 feet.
Maher, sometimes it's very difficult to explain the concept of dimensions to accountants that are used to more traditional accounting systems. How did you accomplish that in this limited time frame on this project?
So let me tell you, we had some very strong consultants on the team that worked hand in hand and really simplified the whole concept for the accounting team. So they worked with them quite extensively to show them some A/B testing, if you will. If we configured the dimensions in one way, here is what it could potentially look like from a reporting standpoint. We configure it a different way. This is what it would look like from a reporting standpoint as well. So they were able to show it to them in such a way that it was easier for the customer to digest, because most of the customers are thinking at the end result. It's hard for them to understand why it was important in the beginning. So hats off to the consultants for being able to kind of show it to them multiple ways and multiple angles. And of course, their industry experience helped kind of pave some of that through for them.
That's great. Yeah, I think the only way to do fast projects is to have a very experienced partner and very experienced consultants. So I was glad you had a team like that on this project.
Day three, we moved on to sales and receivable. In the morning, we did an overview of the customer master, so they understood what all the setups were and where the data was going to land. We completed the sales and receivable setup. And then, of course, we exported the customers from the legacy system to be able to start cleansing that data and bring in some of the setups that we have are specific to Business Central as part of that data cleansing process. They did spend some time getting rid of some customers that they didn't do any business with for the last 5 to 10 years and that kind of stuff. All of that data cleansing happened, again, overnight from the point of export to the point of import, which happened in the afternoon of day three. So what we had to do in the afternoon of day three, we completed some of the setups, for example, payment terms, and make sure all their main payment terms were in play. And then we imported the customers. And as you know, when you're importing data, it doesn't always go so smoothly. So of course, we had to do multiple iterations to get that data in there. And this wasn't one of those 9 p.m. evenings. This was one of those 1 a.m. evenings.
Yeah, so I'm seeing a pattern here where you do a solution overview in the morning and show them how things work. Yeah. Meanwhile, they're exporting some of their data, and then in the afternoon, you're actually importing the data and getting it set up.
That's right, Greg. That's akin to some of that parallel work streams that we were talking about in the slide earlier when I showed you the Gantt chart. These parallel work streams were some of the keys to success. We had multiple teams working on multiple things at the same time, but everybody had to meet at a common point, and that was the afternoon of each day's session. So data export happened while we're doing solution overviews and doing setups, some cleansing of the data, and then in the afternoons, we were bringing that data in. Day four, purchasing and inventory. As you would expect, in the morning, we did an overview of the vendor master. We did an overview of the item master. We completed the purchase and payable setup, and of course, the inventory setup. While all this was going on with the purchasing team, the data team was exporting the vendors out of the legacy system. They were exporting the items out of the legacy system. Once again, some data cleanup happened, some data completeness happened, and they were able to get that data ready for the afternoon session. In the afternoon, we came back with the purchasing team. We entered all the payment terms and began the importing of all the vendors and items, and of course the vendor item catalog as well. That was of course important from an EDI standpoint. Again, keeping that in mind for later. But at the end of day four, we had all vendors in and all items in, as well as, of course, from the sales side, the customers.
I understand you had a lot of master records to convert at this customer. Did you have any speed issues with uploading data to the cloud?
So that's a great question. What we had to do a number of times was do time studies where we would import a small record, 100 records, a small sampling, and be able to see how long that took, and then bring that data in chunks, namely their item data. They had a huge amount of item data. And rather than doing a huge set at once, we brought them into smaller bite-sized pieces. And we found that helped performance, and it helped the data team get caught up on some of the cleanup. So we would have them clean up every 3,000 or 4,000 records at a time, pass them over to the import people, and the import people would bring those in. We also used various techniques, like when we created the packages, we didn't just leave all the fields in the package and force them to validate. We only grabbed the specific fields out of every package that we knew that we were going to import. And what we found was that cut the amount of processing and import time for any item by as much as 80%. So a great lesson here is, let's not leave the package as is that pulls the entire table out. Laser target the fields that you want to import and only bring those fields through the package.
I think that's a great idea for any project, no matter how long it's going to take, because who wants to sit there and wait for data to load?
That's absolutely correct. And we didn't have the time or luxury to wait for it.
I have one more question on this slide before you move on. How did you run the solution overviews without going into the proverbial rabbit holes for the things that happen, once a month that users get focused on?
That's a great question. We call those edge cases. What we wanted to do was we wanted to focus on the 80%. The goal was, let's get 80% in play. If you bring up a scenario that is part of that 20% or that edge case, it very quickly got shot down. It very quickly was told, we can talk about this during phase 2. Not just by our team, but also by the executive management team on their side. So they were able to identify people pulling edge cases in, sending us down rabbit holes, and very quickly tamp that down for us. All right, moving into day 5, we began transacting. So on the morning of day 5, we imported the inventory counts. At this point, we were ready as a fully functioning system. Together, we reviewed all the setups and made sure that we crossed the T's and dotted the I's. In the afternoon of day 5, we ran through our first order to cash cycle, end-to-end cycle, to prove that the system is working as expected. We then ran through our first purchase to pay cycle, all the way through, making sure that everything posted correctly. And then finally, we wrapped it all up by reviewing some of the financial reports that come out of the box. By the way, there's some amazing financial reports with Business Central that we were able to show both cycles and what the outputs were for the accounting department.
How large was your group for that afternoon session, or was it multiple groups?
It was all hands on deck, Greg.
Okay.
We had the entire purchasing team on, the entire sales team on, shipping and receiving was on, the warehouse, the finance team. Everybody was there. There was so much effort put forward in the first 5 or 6 days that this was the fruits of the labor. And this was that point of, hey, we're going to run this end to end. So imagine how nerve-wracking that is when you got an error. And that's expected, right? So we did come across a few errors, and that was our way of being able to show them how to read the errors. What do they mean? How do we fix them? All part of a normal life cycle of a project. But here we needed to show everybody a functioning system so that they can take away into their own respective areas and start transacting. It was that buy-in moment. It was that moment where we got buy-in from everybody and they thought, wow, this is working. It didn't stop there, right? Day 5, Friday, we didn't just hang up our jackets and call it quits. We kept going. So again, everybody was working on the weekend. We had a lot of data verification and cleansing to do. Of course, that came out when we were running the end-to-end transactions and we were starting to see some data misaligned. So we had some data verification done directly in Business Central. That did 2 things for us. It got people in the system. It got them poking around and navigating in the system. Cleaning the data directly in Business Central, not on spreadsheets, not in your legacy system, directly in Business Central. We had to do some additional exports out of the legacy system to bring in some more supportive data that we needed. And then, of course, we updated all the configuration packages in BC. So we had to continue to do this throughout the weekend. A lot of data work, but proved to be fruitful at the end. And then, of course, e-learning. Everybody had to undergo the entire e-learning course that we put in front of them for their respective group. Now, as I mentioned earlier, e-learning began on day one, but just because it's the weekend doesn't mean they stopped e-learning. We had deadlines, and they had to meet their deadlines. One of their deadlines was completing chunks of the e-learning courses each day, which included the weekends.
How did the users adopt the e-learning? Did you get the adoption that you wanted there?
I'll tell you, day one was a little bit difficult. Like you mentioned earlier, getting everybody logged in, getting everybody comfortable in the environment, building everybody's training plans. That took a little bit of time. But then once everybody had their training plans in place and was able to log in and put all that behind us, they actually liked it. They were able to move at their own pace. They could watch and learn them whenever they wanted and when they had time. They just knew that they had to finish a certain amount of lessons by a certain time or day. So moving at their own pace was really helpful. I even had some people watching the same videos 2 and 3 times because it was that important to them that they understood it to that level of depth. Back to the project plan, and this puts us squarely down to the training area. Okay, so at this point, what we've done is you'll see those, the parallel path of the requirements gathering and the data migration happen all at the same time, okay, for that first week. Going into our second week, with the main focus at this point was training. A big part of that was doing some of the transactions, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But what you'll see is the data migration component ended halfway into the second week and picked up again. But the training, the e-learning started from the beginning of the first week and moving us straight through into the second week where we started doing some heavy emphasis. Are you ready to start talking about week 2, Greg?
Yeah, let's go.
Week 2, Monday, sales order training. And what we did here was we took the train the trainer approach. First thing that we did is we trained the managers. We spent a lot of time with the managers, not only training them the system, but what we did was we wanted to make sure that they flushed out their processes. They've been doing things a certain way for years. We didn't want to just say, this is the way it's done in Business Central, go ahead and do it our way. We had to meet them halfway. We had to look at all our different processes and how they did it and made sure that the system was configured to be able to handle it. And if they had to do a short-term workaround until a future phase, they knew how to do it. The management team here worked really well with us to not put up roadblocks, to be able to identify these types of areas where they knew that were going to face resistance from the users, and we ironed them out during the management training so that when they trained the end users for the rest of the week, they already had answers. And as much as we tried to prepare for that, there were times where the manager got stumped. We always had an open line of communication, so the managers would always come to us, the project team, and be able to get the answers that they were looking for. On Tuesday, purchasing training, same cycle here. You're seeing we train the managers in the morning, and then the managers would then continue to train their staff in the afternoon. Not only the afternoon, but the rest of the week. Okay, so the purchasing team was trained from Tuesday all the way out until Friday. On Wednesday, go ahead, Greg.
Did you start sales orders on Monday so they had a whole week to finish up training with the end users after that?
Absolutely. So part of the training was each person needed to create X number of sales orders to get comfortable with the system. So we wanted to make sure that some sales orders were being queued up on Monday so that we can leverage them for training on Tuesday with the purchasing department. We're creating that supply, that demand, to be able to show some of that supply and procure some of that supply. So we were able to do that, and we took a very methodical approach here where, we were creating those sales orders on Monday. Tuesday, we were creating the purchase orders against those sales orders. And then coming in Wednesday with backfilling with some inventory. So we did some inventory training on Wednesday and started posting some of those transactions for the accounting training late in the day Wednesday to start looking at some of that data. By end of day Wednesday, we had a bunch of posted sales orders into invoices. We had a bunch of purchase orders and purchase invoices. We even cycled in some inventory. I was able to show how that impacted on the books when we were doing the accounting training by end of day Wednesday.
Yeah, I'd like to highlight one thing you said there, and that's that you gave them a certain number of sales orders to enter. And I think that's really important because if you tell a user to go create some sales orders, they may or they may not. If you tell them to go create 20 sales orders, then you're going to either get 20 sales orders or a reason why they couldn't do 20. And you're going to get a much more measurable result out of that.
Yes. Yeah, so we had to measure them. We did give them a set number of sales orders and lines within each order that we wanted to see them create. And all those were based on different scenarios of their business. They had to report up to their department manager in terms of, this is what I have created, and this is where I am in the process, so that when it was time to post those sales orders, we were getting some invoices on the tail end as well. Thursday and Friday of the second week was the project team prepping for go live. So their ERP team and us getting ready for go live. And you'll see again, user practice, right? So at this point, by Thursday and Friday, the entire organization was trained. They've all gone through all their cycles and were comfortable with the cycles and really started writing some of their own SOP manuals at this point. But we had a tremendous amount of data in the system at this point. So the user practice was a key to their success going into the go live. All right, cut over into live, one of the most important parts of the project. So again, we worked through the weekend. We leveraged some of those time studies that we did when we were bringing in the initial set of data to measure exactly when we were going to cut all the data over piece by piece during that go live weekend. We cut them over to live Monday morning, and we proceeded with the following 2 weeks of hypercare. So we stayed with them throughout the following 2 weeks to make sure that we would quickly attack issues. They were successful in creating and posting transactions, and of course, reconciling the books. While we were doing that, we already began planning for the next phase. We knew that WMS had to be stood up immediately after. We knew that EDI had to get rolling right away. Interfaces to third-party products, e-commerce, PLM, and then of course Power BI for the accounting department. So while we were supporting the cutover, supporting that 2 weeks of hypercare, the project team and I were already planning some of the next phases and moving forward. Lesson number 1, nailing the critical decisions immediately. That's where department heads and the executive team on the customer side is important to be on every single one of those calls. We locked them up early. They were part of our meetings, and they were able to make decisions, again, in hours, not days. So things like dimensions, costing methods, executive buy-in, because the executives were making the decisions, getting commitment up front, resource availability, access to the data, both legacy and the future data, and then e-learning adoption. So these were 3 really core components that we learned that was a big part of the success of this project, was having available resources around the clock. Phone rings at midnight. That's okay. You get up and you get it. Access to data, bringing it in multiple times till we get it right, happens in every project. And then, of course, day 1, e-learning, let's take it to the end. Managing scope. And we really mean we have to manage scope. It's all too easy to say, can you add this field here? Make a quick change to a page. Make a quick change to a form or a document. It's so easy to say that. And it's so easy to say, yes, we can do that for you. But we had to say no. We had to say no to make sure that we're nailing the timelines. They understood it. We understood it.
Going back to the number 2 there and getting commitment up front, is there any specific challenges that you faced on this project or on similar projects that you'd like to highlight there?
Yeah, so there's always challenges around resource availability. Somebody has a vacation in the middle of the project. Somebody takes a day off or calls out sick or anything like that. We ran into those challenges and we had to get creative in working around them. So if a department head wasn't available on a particular day, the executive sat in for him. The executive made the decisions, and if that department head wasn't available, they still picked up the phone when we called to ask a question. So there were some hurdles there were some challenges. We were able to overcome it. The data is always a challenge. Hats off to the data team. They worked around the clock. They worked around the clock to get the legacy data, reformat it or transform it, clean it up, and get it in the system. That was a huge part of the success here.
And looking at number 3 on managing scope, is there any areas where you made exceptions to this rule?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. There was no exceptions here. It was funny. They got to a point by the second week of asking the same questions, they just stopped asking. They just knew not to ask anymore.
Like dealing with your kids, right?
Right. Some more lessons learned here. Industry experience. Consultants that have done this before. So this goes back to the setup and config sessions that I talked about earlier. Having a strong consulting team is key to guiding the customer to make the right decisions. Being in this boat before, seeing this industry before, knowing how, again, the 80% of the industry configures the system, we were able to guide them through making some of the decisions. Provide perspective guidance on decisions. That's akin to, hey, I've worked in this industry numerous times before. I've done half a dozen implementations in this industry before. Here's what your competitors are doing. Here's how they're doing it. Does this fit into your business model? That was very critical to the success here. What gets measured gets done. Goes back to practicing the transactions. We gave each department a number of transactions that they had to create, number of lines within each transaction they had to create. And each of these were very meticulously designed to make sure that we're hitting different business processes. So they had to do them. It wasn't a matter of, hey, if you have time, it's a matter of, we have to test this business process. You got to create this scenario so that we can measure it downstream. E-learning course completion. We made it mandatory for everybody to finish their entire coursework. And the data import time studies. That was a big help. We did that up front. We did the time studies up front, really just to measure how much time we needed to give the data team to import data. But it proved to be super helpful during the cutover weekend, where they knew at this point how long it was going to take customers to import, how long it was going to take vendors to import, how long it was going to take items to import. And they were able to utilize that and run the timeline of the weekend and make sure that they had all the data imported within that time frame. Post go live hypercare, immediate responses to user questions. We were there on the wire. The entire team was there on the wire the entire time. It was like holding their hand. It was like being on site. Anything and everything that they needed to talk about, whether they were having a bad hair day or they couldn't post a transaction, we were there to listen. Fully staffed virtual room. So we created war rooms within teams, and our consultants were on the wire the entire time, monitoring all the team channels. When the customer had a question, we were there with answers. We had a very defined escalation path for critical issues. The path was designed to give them some ownership and some skin in the game, if you will. The end users always had to go to their managers or their trainers for first level questions. When they were stumped, they would take it up to their ERP team. And when they were stumped, then and only then did the ERP team bring it to us. And the CIO was copied along the way. So we very quickly took it to the top if we needed to, and executed on it just as quickly.
So this is amazing, because it looks to me like not only did we do this project in 19 days, but we did it all remotely too, right?
It was. In these trying times, everybody was remote, and we had to make sure that we executed it remote. So we used all the tools in our arsenal to make sure we kept track of every T that needed to be crossed and every I that needed to be dotted.
And I think many of these lessons that you've taken us through would be useful across any project, not just a super rapid project like this.
That's absolutely correct. Here, we didn't have the luxury of time, so We did it very, very quickly, but we adopted a lot of these methods from a normal project. We just tightened the time frame, so you could take a lot of these and use them in a normal scaled project in the future.
Well, great job. Is there anything else you would like to add over and above this, or have the audience take away?
Yeah, I think some of the most important things and a reoccurring theme that you saw throughout the entire presentation today has been strong executive support that is backing the project. The e-learning portals and the course completion was absolutely paramount, and of course, making sure that we were available to the team anytime that they needed us. To me, I think those three components are really the keys to success, along with these 6 lessons that we learned throughout.
Well, great. Well, thanks, Maher, for taking us through that. Again, if you have any other questions, feel free to let us know. Well, thanks everyone for taking the time to watch our presentation today. Great job, Maher. We had tons of questions during the session. I still see some of them coming in, so I'm just going to read some of these off to you and get your feedback on some of these things.
Sounds great.
So one I'd like to drill down to a little further from Chinky was, what industries are a good fit for this? I answered them with distribution, with light manufacturing. I think it'd have to be any company that's really kind of an out-of-the-box fit for Business Central, right?
Right, and that's exactly what this company was as well. It was a distribution company, and it was, again, right out of the box. There was no special requirements that needed to be rolled out for phase 1.
Great. Crystal had a question. Do you know what methods the client used to hold their internal teams accountable to deadlines in practice?
Bonuses, big ones.
Yeah. Okay, great. And I just want to reinforce one thing that you talked about in the presentation, and that was measuring the number of transactions that people do. Yep. And we've learned that as a key kind of thing to do on projects over the years is you just go into that posted invoices table and filter by user ID and export that to Excel, and you can see how many invoices users are posting, for example. And you can do that in all kinds of transaction tables. It's just a great way to hold people accountable to see if they're practicing or not. So how many users did you have on the system at the time of go live?
It was about 225 at the point of go live.
Okay, great. And I see Ben had a question. We had simple requirements for shipping, receiving, and we kept that simple at first, right?
Yeah, we had to.
Yeah. And WMS was post go live, but you were still managing inventory at go live, right?
Yeah, we had to. We had to have starting balances and have all that in place.
Yeah. So David had a question about wanting to know more about our e-learning tools and strategy. You want to talk a little bit more about how you use Microsoft Learn?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a great site and has a lot of content in it, almost too much content for an end user. So what we did as project managers is we worked with each manager to build a learning plan for each of their employees. And we basically gave them a series of links and said, here you go, you got to get through all this content by X time or by X date. And we're able to break it up into certain components. So for example, navigating through Business Central and filtering and searching and that kind of stuff was a band or a bunch of links that everybody had to watch across the board. And then, of course, the purchasing team, we focused on purchasing and some inventory, the sales team on some sales, and so on and so forth. So we had to build those plans, and they took them and they ran with them.
Yeah, and you didn't use any tasers, right?
No.
Okay, because Vicky had a question here. How do you get end users to do their homework and find the time to practice? And I think that that has to come from the top down from management that this is a priority, right?
It sure does. It sure does. Yeah. And these guys were very motivated.
Yeah, agreed. Another question from Paul. He says, regarding WMS coming in later, did that involve any changes to your location handling? Like how'd you set up the locations originally as far as bin mandatory or require pick, those types of settings?
Yeah, so during phase one, we didn't have any of that, right? So all of that
Right.
was turned off. And then what we did is we created another warehouse, and we did all the bins, and we did have pick mandatory and all of that. And they actually inventoried everything into the new warehouse.
Right.
And then we were able to dump the old warehouse and clear that up. That way we got a much more accurate reading rather than trying to guess what was where and what we were importing in.
Yeah, and I think you went live on WMS about what, 6 to 8 weeks after the original go live?
That's exactly right. It took about 6 to 8 weeks. The warehouse was rather large and required quite a bit of training, so we wanted to make sure we were getting it right.
Right. I think Nitin here had a question: how does this company manage to handle their custom business processes, without any customizations? And that was just strict change management and discipline, right?
That's exactly right. And
Yeah.
strong executive support as well. I mean, the executive team, when we asked people to deviate from their standard processes a little bit, they would get just naturally scared and worried. But the executive team continued to reassure them and tell them that, hey, we'll adhere to these processes and move forward. And I think that was a big driving factor behind it.
Yeah. Henrik, hey Henrik, he has a question on migrating open balances versus historical transactions, and we just did open balances, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, there's no time for historical.
Yeah, but the Power BI data store, that was a great place to take any historical data that they had and bring it in there, and then we can merge that with the Business Central data and give them one data set to report off of.
And that's exactly what we did.
Yeah. Michael has a question. Did you interface back to the legacy WMS before implementing WMS in BC?
No, we did not.
Right. Okay. Did you deal with open orders at all?
Yeah, of course. We had to import them in. We imported in all open sales orders. We imported in all open purchase orders as part of all of the open transaction import process, right? Open AR,
Right.
open AP, all of that had to get imported in, validated, tested, and made sure everything balanced prior to go live.
Great. Did you do Nitin has another question. Did you do an inventory cycle count prior to go live, or did you just go live with what data was in that they had in the legacy system?
Their inventory was pretty accurate. They were very confident that it was clean. And what we did not do a cycle count prior. We trusted their data. We brought it in. We ran reports on both sides, and it balanced. So they were pretty confident about it.
Okay, great. Paul's next question was, so we went bin mandatory later when we implemented the WMS, and did we need to conduct a stock take? And Paul, the answer there is yes. That's when we did the full physical is when they went to bins.
Exactly.
Because you don't want to turn on an automated WMS with bad inventory data. Us consultants that have been through that before don't want to do it again.
That's correct.
Did the customer shut down their business during their time? How did their day-to-day work get completed?
So they split the teams. The management team was involved in a lot of the decision making, and they would split the teams where part of their sales team would be in training, part of their sales team would continue the day-to-day operation. So remember, this was at the height of the COVID shutdown, so they weren't super busy, right? They weren't running at 100%. They were scaled back. So part of their team was sitting around anyway, and we were able to kind of leverage part of the team for the implementation while the other part of their teams continue to operate the business. So no, they did not shut down.
Great. Did you bring in open bank rec items?
Yeah. So all the open transactions, including the bank rec, but we did not do the automated bank rec, right? So that would have required, not until phase 2, because that would have required a little more time.
Sure. To expand on MS Learn, did you still conduct in-person or online training, and the MS Learn content was supplementary, or were the links to MS Learn the only method of training?
It was certainly not the only method of training, but it was a great springboard and covered enough information that when we did do the virtual training like we're doing here, we didn't have to cover a lot of the little things like how to navigate and how to find things, how to sort columns and filter. We expected them to know this stuff. We did overlap some of the training where we covered a lot of the things that MS Learn already presented. But what that did was it gave them an avenue to ask questions, make it their own. Rather than just being barked at, they were able to ask questions that were unique to them and specific to them, and we were able to iron out their processes during the virtual training sessions.
Yeah, certainly. I think that the way that we've been successful positioning eLearn, or I'm sorry, Microsoft Learn, is as a prerequisite to your training with the consultants. It makes the training more effective, so they're not doing the basics on the user interface. It saves the company money because you have less consulting hours to consume, and it really is that, like you said, that springboard to the training process.
Absolutely.
So next is were you uploading open transactions till a late date before go live? Probably late in the night before, right?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Into the morning.
Yep. And someone asked about user count. It was about 220 users, I think, at go live. By the time we got the warehouse done, it was well over 300 users.
That's correct.
Another one is, what is the costing method? Was it average, and if so, how did you handle the costs?
Yeah, so it was FIFO, and we were able to make sure when talking about costing methods, remind the client when we do this, you cannot change it, right? So we spend a great deal of time training them on the different costing methods and what the impact would be. But again, as a distribution company, most of the time we do see them use FIFO, and that's what they did here.
Yeah, I don't know that I'd want to do a 19-day implementation on average.
No.
The other thing that I remember from the implementation is that you started educating on costing methods and their impact to the business on day one, because we know from experience that could be something that bites you later in the project or after go live. So that was one of those things to get ahead of right away.
That's correct.
Did the users have a sandbox access or sample company to explore? They were using Microsoft Learn?
Absolutely. We created one for them early on. We had them use the Cronus company until we got caught up a few days in and brought in some master records and transaction records, and then they switched off of Cronus into their own sandbox with their data. When we did that, everything started making more sense to them, because then they started seeing their items, their customers, their vendors, and everything started clicking. That was the aha moment.
Yep. Yeah, that's true. We have some other questions. Do we think the 80 gigabyte database will be enough for them? Not forever. It's not growing at anywhere near the level of an on-premise database, though. Microsoft's really made a lot of improvements there. The key one being that, if you guys aren't aware, that the SaaS version of BC Cloud uses SQL Enterprise, which has compression turned on. So it uses about 45% of the database size of an on-premise database that's running the standard version of SQL. So that's a big help right there. And also blobs are stored separately. So, attachments and things like that don't count towards your 80 gigabytes. So when you start factoring those types of things in, as well as some of the improvements that Microsoft's made, it's pretty hard to grow a database that fast with just purely transactions.
That's correct.
Laura Peters had this question. So you can't change costing once you're up and running. I would say you can't, but you probably shouldn't, and you should be very careful. It's just one of those decisions that you want to get right. So Michelle said, do you implement as a delegated admin or use up a license during implementation? We use the delegated admin, and we're well aware of the limitations around edit in Excel and approving workflows and that type of thing, and we just know how to work around those. If we have to, then we'll ask a customer to license a specific user for us. Yep. Next question from Cynthia was, did you have realignment meetings? And at what point that you probably had those daily on a project this fast, right?
Absolutely, yeah. We
Yeah.
certainly had to, and that was
Yeah.
important to keep everything on track and everything focused.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. So I believe we're getting to the end of the questions here, Maher.
Yeah.
So thanks for taking the time to answer them all, and thanks for everyone that joined and for all your questions and interaction. We really appreciate it.
Thank you guys very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a good one.